Congratulations. You've been hired as a land development contractor. Not exactly the career you dreamed of, right? But someone has to turn wilderness into civilization. Someone has to cut the roads, clear the forests, and make way for progress. The pay is decent when the contracts come through, and there's always demand for people willing to work in remote areas where most others won't go. My name is Ted, and I've been working in land development and forest clearance for about 6 years now. 6 years of heavy machinery, environmental assessments, and clients who want impossible timelines for projects that should take months. But before I tell you what you're really getting into, let me give you some background. Because if you're smart, and I hope you are, since you'll be working alone in places where help is hours away, you'll want to understand exactly what this job involved beyond operating chainsaws and bulldozers. This story isn't mine. It belongs to my great-grandfather, Samuel Hartwell, who worked as a forest clearance contractor in the 1940s along the remote coastlines of Northern California. Back then, the work was even more isolated, more dangerous, and came with risks that had nothing to do with falling trees or equipment failures. I learned about Samuel's experiences through family stories passed down by my grandmother, Sarah, who was Samuel's daughter. These weren't pleasant bedtime stories. They were warnings about the kinds of contracts you should never accept, no matter how much money they offer. Samuel Hartwell was what people in the 1940s called a timber specialist. He had a reputation for being able to clear forests that other contractors wouldn't touch, either because the terrain was too difficult, the timber too old and massive, or the location too remote for conventional crews. He was also known for having what his contemporaries called unusual capabilities. Samuel came from a family with deep roots in Appalachian folk traditions. He understood things about working with the land that weren't taught in any technical manual. He could find water in drought conditions, predict weather patterns weeks in advance, and somehow convince the most stubborn trees to come down safely even when they defied conventional logging techniques. More importantly, Samuel had what his family called protections. Charms, blessings, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd learned to work alongside forces that most folks preferred to pretend didn't exist. These protections served him well for most of his career, until he accepted a contract that put him in direct conflict with entities that didn't appreciate human interference in their territory. The contract came through a government intermediary in late 1943. The Army Corps of Engineers needed a major access road cut through old-growth forest along the Northern California coast. The project was classified as essential to wartime infrastructure, something about supply lines and coastal defense positions. The timeline was aggressive. Clear a corridor 12 miles long and 50 feet wide through forest that included trees over 300 years old. Complete the work within 6 months. Payment was triple the usual rate for comparable projects. Samuel should have asked why previous contractors had walked away from the job. Instead, he focused on the technical challenges and the financial opportunity. His wife, Martha, was pregnant with their first child. The extra money would set them up for years. "It's just trees," he told Martha when she expressed concerns about the remote location and extended timeline. "I've been cutting timber since I was 15. This is what I do." Martha had her own family traditions, her own understanding of forces that existed beyond normal human experience. "Some trees aren't meant to be cut," she said. "Some forests are meant to stay where they are." Samuel laughed off her concerns. He was a professional contractor with modern equipment and decades of experience. Superstition had no place in commercial forestry. He was wrong about that. Samuel arrived at the project site on a cold November morning in 1943. The forest was unlike anything he'd encountered in his career. The trees were massive, Douglas firs and redwoods that had been growing since before European settlement. The canopy was so dense that noon felt like twilight. Even with industrial equipment, the work would be challenging. But the area itself felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with the technical difficulties. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no small animal sounds, no insects buzzing. Just the wind through the canopy and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky coastline. More disturbing was the complete absence of undergrowth in large sections of the forest. Ancient trees grew directly from bare ground, as if nothing else was permitted to take root. The soil in these areas was dark and rich, but it smelled wrong, too sweet, with an underlying scent of decay that didn't match the healthy appearance of the dominant trees. Samuel set up his base camp near the southern edge of the project area, where the forest met a cleared meadow. He'd brought enough supplies for several weeks of work, planning to make significant progress before returning to town for additional equipment and materials. The first 3 days of cutting went smoothly. Samuel worked methodically, removing smaller trees and clearing underbrush to make space for the larger equipment he'd need for the ancient giants. Standard forest clearance procedures. But on the 4th day, he encountered something that made him reconsider Martha's warnings. Samuel was preparing to fell a Douglas fir that had to be at least 400 years old. He'd made the initial cuts and was positioning his equipment for the final approach when he heard voices coming from inside the tree. Not voices carried by the wind or echoing from somewhere else in the forest. Voices from inside the tree itself, muffled but clearly audible. Multiple voices, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were asking him to stop. Samuel stepped back from the tree and waited. The voices continued for several minutes, becoming more urgent, more pleading. When they finally stopped, the forest silence returned, but it felt different. Watchful. Against his better judgment, Samuel completed the cut. The tree fell with a sound like thunder, shaking the ground and sending up clouds of dust and debris. But as the trunk hit the earth, Samuel heard something that made his hands shake as he shut off his chainsaw. Screaming. Not animal screams or the sound of wood splitting under stress. Human voices, crying out in pain and terror as the tree crashed to the ground. Samuel packed up his equipment and returned to base camp without clearing any more trees that day. He spent the evening reviewing his contract and trying to rationalize what he'd experienced. Auditory hallucinations brought on by extended exposure to chainsaw noise. Echo effects from the unusual forest acoustics. Stress from working alone in an isolated environment. None of those explanations felt adequate, but they were better than admitting he might be hearing voices from entities that lived in centuries-old trees. The next morning, Samuel returned to the cutting area and found something that shattered his rational explanations. Where the Douglas fir had fallen, the ground was stained dark red. Not sap, not the usual moisture released when old-growth timber hits the earth. He couldn't acquire 873 additional black roosters in a matter of hours. He couldn't contact Martha to warn her of the supernatural threat. He couldn't abandon the project without financial ruin. In desperation, Samuel made the worst decision of his life. He decided to provide the entities with human life force by targeting other humans instead of sacrificing his own family. Using techniques his grandfather had taught him for protection against malevolent spirits, Samuel reversed the rituals and turned them into weapons. Instead of seeking protection from supernatural entities, he used the same folk magic to direct those entities toward other targets. Samuel spent the night using remote influence techniques to send the forest entities to attack pregnant women in the surrounding communities. He provided the entities with a list of targets, women he knew were pregnant, women whose life force could substitute for the black roosters he couldn't obtain. By dawn, 7 women in 3 different towns had suffered unexplained miscarriages. Their unborn children simply vanished from their wombs, leaving no trace except the devastating grief of families who couldn't understand what had happened. The forest entities were satisfied with the payment. Samuel was permitted to complete his road clearance project without further supernatural interference. But the cost of that permission was higher than Samuel had anticipated. The families affected by the mysterious miscarriages began investigating what they all had in common. They discovered that Samuel Hartwell was the only outsider who had recent contact with all of the affected families. He had visited their farms while searching for black roosters. Suspicion fell on Samuel quickly. While the townspeople couldn't prove he was responsible for supernatural attacks, they could make his life impossible through social ostracism and professional sabotage. More seriously, the folk magic Samuel had used created a permanent connection between himself and the forest entities. They had tasted human life force through his rituals, and they wanted more. The entities began visiting Samuel's dreams, demanding that he provide them with additional victims on a regular schedule. Every Friday night, they wanted him to sacrifice another human life to feed their growing appetites. Samuel refused these demands, but the entities had leverage. They threatened to target Martha and their unborn child if Samuel didn't continue providing them with human victims. Samuel found himself trapped in an escalating cycle of supernatural extortion. To protect his own family, he was being forced to facilitate attacks on other innocent people. The situation came to a head in March 1944, when Martha went into labor during Samuel's most difficult negotiations with the forest entities. Samuel was performing a ritual intended to redirect the entity's attention away from his family when Martha's labor pains began. She was alone in their remote cabin, struggling through a difficult birth while Samuel was miles away trying to manage supernatural threats he could no longer control. The forest entities took advantage of Samuel's divided attention. While he was focused on protecting Martha during the birth, they launched their most aggressive attack yet, targeting not just unborn children, but entire families in the surrounding communities. On the night Samuel's daughter was born, supernatural entities attacked a farm family 15 miles from his location. Parents, children, and livestock were all found dead the next morning, drained of life force in ways that left no physical evidence of violence. Samuel realized that his attempts to manage the supernatural situation had made it worse, not better. The entities were no longer satisfied with occasional sacrifices. They wanted unlimited access to human victims, and they were using Samuel's protective rituals as guidelines for finding new targets. Samuel made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He chose to sacrifice himself to break the supernatural contract. On a Friday night in late March, Samuel returned to the forest where his troubles had begun. He performed a final ritual, offering his own life force in exchange for permanent protection for his family and community. The forest entities accepted his offer, but with modifications. Instead of simply killing Samuel, they bound his life force to their territory permanently. Samuel would remain alive, but trapped in the forest, serving as a permanent intermediary between the supernatural entities and the human world. Martha found Samuel's body 3 days later, when he failed to return from what she thought was a routine equipment check. He was lying at the base of the Douglas fir he had cut weeks earlier, his body unmarked, but his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Samuel was buried in the local cemetery, but according to family stories, that wasn't the end of his involvement with forest clearance projects. For decades afterward, contractors who took jobs in old-growth forests along the Northern California coast reported encounters with a figure who warned them away from certain areas. A man in 1940s work clothes who would appear at remote work sites and explain which trees could be safely cut and which needed to remain untouched. Some contractors followed his advice and completed their projects without incident. Others ignored the warnings and experienced equipment failures, accidents, and supernatural harassment that drove them off their job sites. My grandmother Sarah grew up hearing these stories from forestry workers who knew Samuel's reputation. According to their accounts, Samuel's spirit had become a permanent guardian of the forest, preventing other contractors from making the same mistakes that had cost him his life and the lives of innocent people. The road Samuel was hired to build was never completed. The Army Corps of Engineers abandoned the project after Samuel's death, citing budget constraints and changing military priorities. The forest corridor Samuel had cleared was allowed to grow back naturally. But the supernatural entities Samuel had awakened never returned to their dormant state. Over the following decades, the region developed a reputation for unexplained disappearances and supernatural phenomena. Hikers, campers, and hunters reported encounters with entities that matched the descriptions of the forest spirits Samuel had contacted. Most disturbing were the continued reports of supernatural attacks on pregnant women in communities near old-growth forests. The pattern was always the same: unexplained miscarriages accompanied by sightings of strange figures in the woods. Local authorities eventually established informal protocols for dealing with these incidents. Pregnant women were advised to avoid certain forest areas. Contractors working on projects near old-growth timber were required to follow specific safety procedures that had nothing to do with conventional workplace hazards. And every few years, forestry workers reported encounters with Samuel's spirit, still trying to prevent other people from repeating his mistakes. I learned these stories from my grandmother when I started working in land development. She made me promise never to accept contracts involving old-growth forest clearance, no matter how much money was offered. Some jobs aren't worth the risk, she told me, and some mistakes can't be undone, no matter how much you regret them later. I followed her advice for my entire career. I work on agricultural clearance, suburban development, and infrastructure projects in areas that have been previously disturbed by human activity. I avoid virgin forests, ancient trees, and any contract that requires me to work alone in areas where the trees are older than the oldest human settlements. It's a limiting philosophy for someone in my profession, but it's kept me alive and free of supernatural entanglements. I've also continued the family tradition of maintaining protective rituals when I work in natural areas. Nothing elaborate, simple offerings of respect, requests for permission, acknowledgments that I'm a guest in spaces that belonged to other entities long before humans arrived. Most of my colleagues think these practices are superstitious nonsense, but my family's experience with Samuel's story taught me that superstition is often just incomplete understanding of forces that operate outside conventional scientific models. The land development industry attracts people who see natural spaces as resources to be exploited rather than complex ecosystems with their own rules and inhabitants. That attitude works fine when you're dealing with recently disturbed areas or land that has already been altered by human activity. But when you're working with truly wild spaces, old-growth forests, untouched wetlands, mountains that have never been developed, you need to approach the work with more humility and awareness. You need to understand that you're not just moving trees and dirt. You're potentially disrupting relationships and territories that have existed for longer than human civilization. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that some of those territories are actively defended by entities that don't share human priorities about economic development and infrastructure expansion. If you're considering a career in land development, learn about the history of any site before you accept a contract. Research previous projects in the area. Talk to local workers about their experiences. Pay attention to warning signs that go beyond conventional safety concerns. And if someone offers you an unusually high payment for work in an area that other contractors have avoided, ask yourself why other professionals have walked away from what appears to be a lucrative opportunity. Sometimes the answer is simple: difficult terrain, legal complications, logistical challenges. Sometimes the answer involves considerations that aren't covered in engineering textbooks. Either way, no contract is worth risking your life or the lives of innocent people. Samuel Hartwell learned that lesson at a cost that echoed through generations of his family and an entire region of Northern California. Don't repeat his mistakes.